Everybody, and welcome back to You Can't Win. This is Tom here, and I'm joined by Don as usual. And today we have our returning guest, Professor Pizzagate, Dr. Pizzagate now, actually. Congratulations, Mike.
Thank you very much, Tom. I appreciate that.
Yeah, congrats. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, recently got his PhD.
I was not a real professor.
Well, in my eyes, you always have been.
Sure.
But yeah, it's been a while since we had you on. We've talked to you about the COVID vaccines, about COVID just in general, kind of before, that became like a thing that we all kind of are obsessed with. And I thought it would be a good idea to just check in with you and see where your thoughts are. Have your ideas about, for example, the vaccines played out or not, or, what are you thinking about this stuff?
It's kind of interesting the way that things have turned out, just because, some of the stuff that we were talking about very early on that was later treated as, like highly conspiratorial, like the idea that the origin of COVID might have been, a lab in Wuhan, are now coming back and, being mainstreamed. And, indeed, like that, some of the things that we were talking about the vaccines, in terms of there's a very large number of them being approved all at once. And given the track record of the industry, a reasonable prior belief about the outcome is going to be that some of those vaccines are going to have pretty serious problems. I mean, I think those things largely panned out and turned out to be, not perhaps as conspiratorial as they were being treated in, even recent months. Like, it's pretty wild, actually, to see some of the changing media discourse about this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the lab leak thing, I haven't really been following that lately, like what people have been saying about that, but yeah, you're right, it does seem to have become more like a mainstream, like, oh, this actually may have merit to it and whatnot. So is there any like new developments, or like do you have any ideas about why that's happened?
So this is really interesting to me, right? Because I mean, it was always the most plausible explanation for the emergence of a new coronavirus with these characteristics in Wuhan, right? Like, it's just, I mean, there was a paper that we referenced, I think, back on the original Corona episode that was extremely quickly removed from whatever preprint server it was on, where a couple of, Chinese scientists were saying, well, like, look, like, people don't eat bats in Wuhan, right? Like, this is not like a staple of their food. And, it, like, there are bats at the seafood market. Like, is that really more plausible than the two known research institutions which keep stocks of coronavirus samples in the same town, one of which was not the Wuhan Institute for Virology, but was the local branch of the Chinese CDC, was very close to that seafood market that was the alleged origin of the virus. So, I mean, I just think that this was always kind of the more plausible thing, or the more plausible explanation for where this came from. And it kind of got mixed in with all of this, like, bioweapon speculation. And,
right.
I think early on we were talking about, in the first episode, we mentioned this idea that, like, maybe it was these Canadian researchers who had been recently dismissed from a Canadian institute. And, my opinion on that was just kind of guilt by association, like, probably not the origin of of COVID, nor representing some kind of, like, secret bioweapons plot there. And, I mean, I think the bioweapons part of that, or like the idea that this is like a biological attack, is probably the more problematic part of, like, what is going around about that. And I mean, to some extent it's irrelevant, right? Like, whether or not it was an engineered bioweapon or not, mm-hmm. Like, someone could still be benefiting from this. But in terms of, like, why is this coming around again now? I think that's a great question. And I think probably, like, if you could understand something about why, for instance, Melinda Gates decided to disclose that the reason for her filing for divorce with Bill is, this Epstein association at the very time that this is occurring, and that like the Biden administration is doing a big about face on this, and like Fauci's looking pretty bad in the media, and people are starting to like call for his head. I mean, I think these things, like there are other games going on that are just not really obvious to us, of the hoi polloi, right? So it's hard to say, but like, I think really, like, you have to treat all of this as psychological operations, right? Like anyone who was telling you a year ago, like, no, the science says that like this was transmitted from bats or like pangolins or something like that, and is now saying, oh, like maybe it was bioweapon or something, like those people are operators, right? Like you can't trust what they're saying to begin with, and I think like we just see this constantly, right, with the vaccines, with the regulatory agencies. Like there's a very coordinated set of messages that are being delivered. And if you're familiar with the scientific literature on this stuff, it's just obvious that you're being operated on, right? Like it's completely shameless and completely ignores like huge chunks of the evidence whenever these people are talking. So I think whatever the reason is, I mean, it's not because like people want a really honest investigation into like the Wuhan Institute of Virology or what was going on there. I mean, there are other political objectives at play, I assume.
So the recent news, I guess the controversy is that there was maybe like three researchers or something like that at the Wuhan Institute that were admitted to hospital in November or something like that of 2019.
Yeah.
I think that's the current story. And that seems to be the thing that people are debating back and forth. They're like, well, it doesn't necessarily have to be this virus or not, but like it does seem. I mean, it seems like circumstantial evidence of some direct involvement there. So I guess that was new news. I don't know if I don't know what the upshot from that is. As you said, like you can't like if China like tried to downplay or hide the virus in different ways, which they might have done early on and stuff. It's like that's bad to some extent, but it's not like it doesn't explain why it was so poorly contained in most of the world or whatever. Like there's a lot of other factors at play there. So yeah, it gets confusing. So yeah.
Totally, and I actually don't know if that particular bit of news had been reported before. I mean, the tricky thing that's happening is that lots of the stuff that's kind of being pushed about the Wuhan Institute has either been reported before, or like the agencies that are leaking it now or whatever knew about it for a long time, right? And there's some indication that they knew about it for a long time. And I mean, at the same time, right, you have the Chinese just flipping the script and saying like, well, no, actually it was from like a Maryland Army Research Institute or something like that, which, I mean, like, it's not totally implausible either. Like, and part of the crazy, kind of background to all of this is that, as is now becoming well known, Fauci, I think, was forced to admit in congressional testimony that his signature is on grant documents approving money for research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology on coronaviruses. And like, he disputes whether or not that was for gain of function. It doesn't really matter. The point is that like this came from a coronavirus research program, and one that was an integrated US-China project.
Mm-hmm. Right, and that's part of the, that was always part of the early conspiracy sort of minded idea, right? Like, oh, this was Fauci's lab, and, of course they take that into kind of bizarre directions of like, well, so he's in league with the Chinese to unleash this bioweapon and all that kind of stuff. And we don't necessarily need to go to that extent with it, but, it's interesting to see like there's something there,
Yeah, and I mean, I think like the overt kind of like, okay, pandemic ideas about this, I mean, they're not really necessary. I mean, like, we know that they predicted for a long time that this would occur. If like, let's say you're some American lizard person and you want a pandemic. And for whatever reason, maybe just like local commercial reasons, like you're invested in Pfizer stock and not in some other pharmaceutical companies. If you're looking at the material that these people were just like openly publishing, right? And you're vaguely aware of what is going on in China. I mean, it was known and reported on for a long time that, China had problems with accidental lab releases of the original SARS, like multiple accidental lab releases in major urban areas, including Beijing, right? So you can be reasonably assured that this is going to happen at some point, and the game would be to be positioned in order to exploit it, and not necessarily to like literally design a bioweapon. A coronavirus is a shitty platform for bioweapon engineering because, as we all now know, I mean, the rate of mutation of these things in their infected hosts is quite high. So, if you have an engineered feature in this virus, like you're going to lose it pretty quickly. You're not going to maintain control over whatever the engineered system does. So that's not good, right? I mean, the problem with bioweapons is that they're not predictable. I mean, it's similar with some chemical weapons. Like they're just incredibly difficult to deploy. So it really makes no sense to make one that like by definition you're going to lose control of within 6 months, right? Like that just makes no sense. So the kind of like maybe like let it happen on purpose to repurpose a 9/11 conspiracy phrase.
Yeah.
That type of explanation seems way more plausible to me. And there clearly are like just weird things happening in this industry, like the extent of the kinds of psychological operations that are happening now in the media is unprecedented. Nobody will talk about like the criminal history of these companies as it relates to their conduct in clinical trials, right? Like like Pfizer's not nominated DOJ chronic offender because of like financial shenanigans and money laundering. It's literally because they manipulate trial results, right? So like the fact that like nobody will have any skepticism whatsoever about any of these vaccines, tells you that something else is going on here. And I mean, look, like in the Canadian context, we have stuff like the Berry and Honey Sherman case, right? So we have a quite large generic drug manufacturer based mainly in Toronto, actually, and called Apotex, that was run by a pair of wealthy socialites, Berry and Honey Sherman. And like these are just well-known people. Everybody kind of understood what their role was in the ecosystem here, and they were like, I mean, Barry, who's the CEO of the company, was just like widely hated in the industry because he was extremely good at identifying products that were vulnerable to kind of genericization. And they were like brutally murdered a couple years ago. I think it was like 2017. Wow. Like, and just no explanation. Toronto police were just they just seemed like actively trying to avoid like drawing any conclusions whatsoever, which and initially like suggested it was a suicide when it was like very obviously like an organized like mob style hit. This kind of stuff. Like there's a lot of weird stuff that happens in this industry, and it's important to understand that. And it's important to understand that the marketing departments and the statistics departments of these companies are psychological operations departments. That's what they're for. That's what they do. And that kind of aspect of it is impossible to ignore. Like we should expect weird stuff to be happening because that's how these firms operate.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think part of it is for someone like me who just got the shot last Friday, like the Pfizer one, and looking forward to getting the second shot and stuff. I think there is like a really big investment that a lot of us have into wanting everything to go as smoothly as possible because of how bad things have been for about a year and a bit or whatever.
Sure.
And even when we talk about things like maybe you need to get a booster shot here and there and stuff, it's like, okay, that's not the end of the world for me, whatever, right? Like it's bad and maybe someone's going to profit off of it or whatever. But like, I think that a lot of people, they do have that kind of thing of wanting, there's like a psychological reason why you want to ignore a lot of this controversial kind of things just because it would be nice if you didn't have to worry about it, kind of thing, right?
Absolutely.
But it is one of those things where I wonder, are we going to have like a long reckoning for years of trying to piece apart what has happened and trying to fix it? Or are we going to have just like, you know, it's time to move on, kind of like after Bush and Iraq and stuff like that? Just like, you know, don't worry about it. Don't overthink it. Just, you know, turn the page kind of thing. So, yeah.
That seems more likely. That plus kind of, you know, politicizing it into blue team, red team kind of things, which is obviously already a huge part of this. But like, I think at some point it's going to be like, if, you know, once things have normalized to some extent, whatever that involves, if it involves booster shots or, you know, whatever, it'll just kind of be like, no, everything kind of went fine. We got the vaccines out and then it all worked out. And any kind of like critical look at it, any sort of like, you know, criticism of the way these companies have been involved in any of this or any of that kind of thing, it's just going to be seen as like, oh, you're just, you know, MAGA chudding kind of, you know, that whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, like, as far as the popular discourse goes, it'll be memory hold for sure. I mean, the same way that like, because this just, it keeps happening over and over and over with this industry, right? Where there's some big scandal, and you know, you see these hilarious things, right? Like we have on Twitter this guy. You guys have probably seen his tweets, like Dr. Eric Fagelding or whatever his name is, and he, you know, his claim to fame is that he was, you know, an epidemiological researcher or health economist that was involved in demonstrating that, like, I think Vioxx was causing heart attacks or whatever. So it's like his whole thing is, his whole claim to fame is like being skeptical about industry results, you know, and doing forensic analyses of these kinds of things. And he's been one of the biggest hypers of the vaccines. You know, and I haven't really seen him say, like, you know, we should be careful. Like, we should like look seriously at these results in the light of what we already know. Like, we have prior information about the conduct of these companies that needs to be taken into account. But you know, I mean, Don, to your point, like, let's say, okay, there's a vaccine that is released, and it, you know, it doesn't really matter which one, but like, let's just pretend that one ends up having like a 1 in 10,000 chance of just like killing you dead, right? Which would be totally unacceptable by, you know, the standards that have been kind of broadly accepted as like normative for like the level of death that you get out of vaccines. Even if that's the case, I mean, you know, and you have a 1 in 10,000 chance of dying, you know, every time you get one of these shots, you could still, I mean, the majority of people who get these shots, let's say for the rest of their lives, are not going to die from it, right? So like, you and all your friends can be like, no, I got the shot and I was fine, right? Like, and like, that's going to be how it goes, right? Like, lots of people are going to get these shots. Most of them are not going to get sick and die. And, you know, even if, like, let's just take the vaccine adverse event reporting system in the U.S., otherwise known as VAERS. It's now conspiratorial to look at that or to think about it at all. But you know, let's take that leap and just ask, you know, okay, so let's just take this at face value. Let's be optimistic and say there aren't that many fake reports on here, or at least the level of fake reporting is going to be similar across vaccines, something like this. Like, what we're seeing is probably like 30 to 50 times the toxicity in coronavirus vaccines as we see in influenza vaccines. It's very high. I mean, the number of reports that we have for the coronavirus vaccines exceeds the number of reports, I believe, for all other vaccines from 97 to present. So, you know, I mean, and the kind of mainstream narrative about this is like, okay, well, this is all anti-vaxxers that are like, you know, dogpiling the reports. And I mean, I've looked at a lot of the reports and they don't look like that. I mean, some of them are inadequate for sure, but, you know, I don't see a lot of evidence of fraud. I mean, I haven't done a forensic analysis, but it does seem like there are a lot of adverse events being reported. And it's not just because of scale. Like, flu vaccines are administered to, you know, something like 160 million people in the US a year. That's a lot of people, similar to, you know, the scale of the coronavirus rollout, except every year. So, you know, I mean, I think that, like, we can still have an unacceptably toxic vaccine and have, at least from like what used to be the normal regulatory perspective, and still have life go on as normal, right? Like, and for most people, it just looks like nothing's happening. Like both of those things can be going on, and this just will fade into the background of the sort of noise of declining empire and a decrepit society and all of these other kinds of things that are going to be killing us and just eroding our quality of life. Like the vaccine, like I almost feel like the people who are talking about like a mass sterilization event, or like everyone who has a vaccine is gonna like drop dead within 12 months, like trust me, like they want it to happen just so that like the negativity or the problem with the vaccine can just be acknowledged, right? Because you would need something that severe in order for people to be like, whoa, like we have to stop. Because at this point, Don, as you say, like there are extremely powerful psychological reasons to just like not really want to bother with this and say like, okay, well, what's the difference between 1 in 250,000 people dying of blood clots and 1 in 50,000 or 1 in 25,000 or whatever it ends up being, and I think that's why the kinds of psyops that we see going on are so effective, because there is that huge expectation. It's like I can go back to normal, I can live life again, so.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of works both ways, right? Like the people that you're talking about that want it, like almost want this like strong negative thing associated with the vaccine, which doesn't really fit with the statistics around it and all that. I think that would also make it easy to blame their political enemies, right?
Yeah.
Like it would be really easy to be like, oh, they pushed this vaccine and now there was all these like bad effects from it, just like I predicted, and that's all because of the Democrats and blah 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 blah. It makes it like a really nice and easy, like again, blue team, red team sort of narrative. But I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. How much of these issues do you think is a result of like the speed at which they tried to roll these things out?
Probably lots, especially with the adenoviral vaccines. So the blood clots issue seems to be mostly the AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson vaccines, which have an adenovirus vector. And so, I mean, I think one of the things that I mentioned in the vaccines episode that we did was just that, the mRNA vaccines have the advantage that the only thing that you're dealing with in the vaccine is the mRNA. So when you're dealing with something like an adenoviral vector for your sequence, like basically these things are doing the same thing. They're getting the sequence of a part of the viral spike protein into your cells, and then your cells make the viral protein, right? So they're kind of like the same type of approach, but the difference is that with the mRNA vaccines, you just have that sequence, and the adenoviral vectors have all of this additional sequence and their DNA. So there was just a report released. I don't know if this is actually the case, right? Like this is the first report of this, but I think this German group is suggesting that the adenoviral vector is entering cellular nuclei where it's being integrated into the genome or being spliced in some way that is producing this toxic effect, whereas the mRNA vaccines do not do this. So if that turns out to be what's going on there, then yeah, I mean that's kind of not surprising and is related to the emergency use authorization stuff, right? Like this is stuff that will show up in general in phase 3 clinical trials, and there are a lot of vaccines that fail phase 3 clinical trials. Like it's hard to overemphasize how unusual it is for like everyone in the industry to have a vaccine development project directed against some target that all succeed at once. Like that's never happened before, right? So definitely
Yeah.
like the speed is going to imply that some of these projects have problems that would have showed up in clinical trials, and that's simply like that's why the emergency use authorizations are there, right? Because the companies will not administer these things with like potentially unlimited legal liability if they end up having really serious problems. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to say that, you brought up the, AstraZeneca side effects and stuff. And I guess I'm interested in this kind of more in the global political economy kind of side of things.
Yeah.
Like how, I mean, for selfish reasons, I care about, like, say, myself getting the Pfizer shot and then, being able to visit people and stuff like that. Like, I care about that.
Mm-hmm.
But from a scientific health / economics perspective, I noticed a lot of interesting things. Like, United States is giving away a lot of the AstraZeneca, and I think even Canada is maybe going to start doing that too. It's dumping. I mean, it looks like, to the world at least, like that it's dumping substandard vaccines on people that can't afford to say no.
Yeah,
that's kind of like the way it looks like.
That's exactly
we're
right.
Basically taking the bar rag,
just
like wringing it out into a mug and giving it to you guys.
Yeah, and then you're seeing, a lot of you're seeing some sort of like vaccine sort of diplomacy with China and Russia giving away a lot of them. But as you said, like those, as far as I know, those ones are also the adenovirus ones you were talking about, right? Like it's like they're ones not based on the mRNA, whatever.
There are a bunch of different.
They would maybe, they would potentially have the same kind of maybe side effects as AstraZeneca or something, or lower effectivity rates or whatever. Like, is that I'm portraying that I'm not very scientifically literate here, but like, is that like, is there going to be sort of this situation where large numbers of people are getting vaccines that maybe don't even match the cautionary kind of standards that you're worried about here, kind of thing? So, yeah.
It's happened before. There are a number of different examples of particularly trials in Africa where what appeared to have been substandard batches were administered. Like there's just a lot of toxicity. I think we mentioned one of those in the Bill Gates episode, because the Gates Foundation has funded many of those. So this is really in no way out of character for this industry and for the sort of NGO sphere that's associated with it. I think the trouble that I have parsing this stuff is that, particularly in the West, it's not very clear that like state interests are being prioritized over corporate interests. And I think kind of the upper hand is consistently being shown to be with the corporations, right? Like certainly in their dealings with our governments, they have no obligations, right? Like in general, like they're signing contracts, getting the money up front from the governments, and like when you look at the contracts, which are like by and large secret, they have no legal liability. And they have no obligation to deliver on any particular schedule, right? So they can just keep telling us, like we're seeing this in Canada, for instance, with the Moderna vaccines. They can tell us, oh yeah, we're going to deliver like X million doses by the end of summer or whatever it is, and just like not do that, and actually probably internally have assessments that say that's like not possible, given their supply chain situation and their production situation. So that's kind of what's happening at the industrial affairs level, in the West, right? So countries that have even less kind of influence over like major transnational corporations, and who depend even more heavily on their inputs to their economy or whatever, are going to be faring even worse. So yeah, they're going to be taking whatever they can get, as long as they think that like this is going to help in some way, or at least suppress like popular dissent if vaccines are being administered, whatever the objective happens to be. So I mean the part about not being able to distinguish like corporate action from government action, I mean for me, I think what's important about that is that like for instance, okay, take the AstraZeneca thing. Like the AstraZeneca problems were reported on widely, extremely widely, and with a level of candid detail that, even though all the regulators were coming out and saying like, no, like the first vaccine you're offered is the best one, just take whatever, like it doesn't matter. they were shouting about that, but like the actual reportage allowed you to figure it out, right? And say, okay, like I would probably prefer to have one of these other things. It's not clear like that itself wasn't some type of like marketing coup by Pfizer and Moderna, right? Where they managed to kind of like push those narratives into the mainstream. And it's not like their vaccines aren't having problems, right? Like you can go look at the reports on VAERS or elsewhere and find, yeah, like they do indeed have side effects. Like the rate is lower, but like, you have the myocarditis stuff with the Pfizer vaccine, for instance. And like there's a couple of lots of both the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines that have been logged on VAERS that have a fairly large number of deaths, and that's the kind of pattern that you would expect from like manufacturing variability and problems arising from that. So like in terms of, okay, well, like AstraZeneca is not the favored vaccine anymore, let's dump this on the very poor. Like to some extent that could be geopolitical, like explicitly, but on another level it's like, okay, but probably Pfizer has won some kind of like marketing success among the Western elite, right? Like everyone who has a little bit of money and like can afford to wait or whatever is going to shoot for the Pfizer vaccine, knowing what they know about the AstraZeneca vaccine. So it's not, I don't know, like it's hard to say whether or not this is like a state thing or is it, corporations kind of fighting among themselves.
So let's talk a little bit about the effectiveness of the vaccines.
Sure.
That was one thing that I think we discussed last time about them, that we weren't expecting them to be as effective as maybe people were hoping. Now, since then, cases have gone down, right? A lot of people are attributing that to the vaccine rollout and all that. Now, it's not that they've only gone down, right? There was like a small peak. Like I'm looking at a chart here. Here in Illinois, there was like a peak in like mid-April where it basically went back up to like the first peak, actually higher. And now we're sort of in a little bit of a lull. It seems to be kind of going down again, but we've seen this before, right? Like we've seen it go up and then come down and then like spike back up. So I'm still very much like wait and see. I think a lot of people are kind of jumping the gun in terms of like saying like, oh, they're super effective. Like obviously like they work. Everyone who doubted it is an idiot, all that kind of stuff. I mean, we just started this. Like, I don't think you can make any conclusions about it yet. I think it's, you just got to play it out and see what happens. That's sort of how I feel about it. What are your thoughts? Have they changed at all since the last time we talked about this, or what?
I do think that the mRNA vaccines are a little bit more effective than I suspected initially. Like I strongly suspected, like when the BioNTech CEO came out and was like, yeah, like COVID's going to be with us for 10 years. And that was like, 3 months into his product's trial. I was kind of like, okay, like this thing doesn't work. But I think, I think at this point it's unreasonable to think that, the vaccines don't have any effect whatsoever. And I mean, I think the more important question is like, are they effective enough? In terms of like, is the length of the protection conferred and the number of, let's say, mutant targets that could be neutralized by the antibodies that are raised by the vaccine. So, what I'm saying is like the effectiveness against variants. If those things are high enough, given the levels of production that we have and given the rate of administration that we're achieving, to end a pandemic, without substantial other kinds of restrictions, like they call them non-pharmaceutical interventions, by which they mean lockdowns and travel restrictions and things like that. And I'm skeptical of that. I don't, I think it's probably possible that it's definitely possible that vaccines are in part responsible for the declining cases that we see. I don't put much stock in case data. You guys maybe heard that, in January, shortly after Biden was elected and the vaccine rollout began, they like the CDC changed their PCR guidance for the cycle thresholds required to call a case positive. basically they made the test less sensitive just as they were rolling out the vaccines. So it's not really a surprise that cases have gone down across the board. And I mean, in many jurisdictions, we're still doing non-pharmaceutical interventions of one kind or another, lockdowns or what have you. So it's incredibly challenging to tease these things out of these data series. And everyone treats them like it's just one kind of continuous, uncontaminated stream of data. And that's not true at all. So, I mean, basically what I think you like for me, what the ball that my eye is on is this kind of interplay between, you know, what's being called vaccine nationalism and this kind of commitment that we have to like a liberal travel regime, right, where you can just kind of go wherever you want, you have a passport. You know, the kind of global bourgeoisie expects to be able to be highly mobile and to, you know, go into the US whenever they want and this kind of stuff. I think those things are probably incompatible. You know, I think basically like if the idea was, and you know, you still hear this is kind of the rationale that is given when people kind of like tisk the US for not sending India like fermenter components, for instance, which they need to make vaccines. You know, they don't make them indigenously. You know, or does the same thing to Canada for, you know, like taking vaccines from like the COVAX program, which is supposed to, you know, the intent is to distribute vaccines more equitably across the world. You know, I think what's being missed there in this kind of like liberal idea of like, okay, we're going to vaccinate the entire world at once, right? We're going to administer like, you know, 8 billion doses to everyone, you know, within 4 months, and they're all going to be fully vaccinated, and that's going to end the pandemic. I mean, that's not materially possible right now, and will not be, you know, for some time, like probably a couple of years, for the bioplastics industry to scale up to anything remotely capable of doing that. So, you know, I think basically, you know, the thing to keep your eye on in terms of whether or not vaccines will work is whether or not any particular jurisdiction can amass the manufacturing supplies necessary to create the vaccines within the, you know, kind of allotted time period until the next variant that escapes the vaccines roll around, you know, while they shut down travel. Because you're not going to be able to do this with vaccine production as it is without preventing new variants that escape the vaccine from entering. And I think that you know, the reality is simply that the kind of mobility regime for people that we kind of enjoyed through the last part of the 20th century is incompatible with kind of a post-COVID world. I don't, you know, so basically what I'm saying is that like, if you're Israel, this might work, right? Like you might be able to lock down your borders and vaccinate everyone and keep everyone
Israel
out.
doesn't have any borders, so
yeah. Oh man. Okay. Yeah. Right.
but yeah, point taken.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that would be good for the environment too, if there was less people flying around all the time, I guess.
Well, and I think ultimately, like that's probably how this will be sold. You know, and the zooming classes or whatever you want to call them are probably okay with this anyways. Like business travel was, you know, I mean, some people liked it, I guess, but you know, it's obviously now it's unnecessary and kind of pointless. But you know, I mean, I think that basically, like, if politically it's just like not possible to do that, to interfere with the, you know, free movement of people across borders, you know, in this huge way, like maybe for instance the US is just too reliant on like you know, immigrant workers, like H-1B visas, like whatever it is, to stop, then the vaccine is not going to be effective, in my opinion, or it's going to be much more implausible that the vaccine will be the solution that ends the pandemic.
Right. Even if they are effective, just like it can't be the yeah, you have to control other factors and stuff.
Yeah.
So one thing that I had heard, and I don't know if this has been like debunked or what, but I was curious to hear your thoughts on it, was the idea that the vaccines are they're most effective at preventing hospitalization and the severity of cases when you do get it. It's not so much about preventing you from actually getting the virus. It's more about how badly does that virus then affect you once you get it.
Yep. So I
And
was
maybe I'm misunderstanding the news story and everything, but
no, that's it. I mean, and I didn't understand this when I spoke on these vaccines last time, and have since been apprised of the situation, which is simply that the trial was arranged in such a way that was the endpoint of concern. Like that's what they're measuring, is the effect on serious illness and hospitalization, and not on transmission. So they're not even making claims necessarily about transmission. I mean, like, you'll see it in the literature that, like, people say, okay, well, probably this does have an effect on transmission, but and it's hard to see how it would not have some effect on transmission if it does have an effect on hospitalization and so on. But at the same time, like, that's the companies themselves are not claiming that this is going to stop transmission. And I mean, you see this kind of weird like revisionist rhetoric about this now, where it's like, well, vaccines have never been like 100% effective, right? Like they've never stopped transmission. It's like, yeah, but it's like, other vaccines are not targeting 100% efficiency at stopping transmission. That's true, but at the same time, like, you want it to be pretty good, right? And if it's like not a claim that you're making at all, if it's not something that is going to the regulator for scrutiny at all, that suggests to me that there's probably going to be problems. And like the CDC has recently decided, I believe, that they're not going to track breakthrough cases in vaccinated people specifically, in all cases at this point. So I think it's only in serious hospitalization, right? And so, I mean, like, this is the thing. It could well be that there are many breakthroughs, but because the people are vaccinated, they have one dose of the vaccine, or even two in some cases. I mean, there are recorded cases of this. Because they have been vaccinated, their symptoms are less. So they may be transmitting, they may have transmissible COVID infection, but it's just not enough viral load to put them in hospital. And we just don't know that it's happening, because the positive test that they get later is not being associated with their vaccination status. So there are a number of possible problems around that. And I mean, I just, like, I don't have a grasp of, like, what the actual, let's say, effectiveness against transmission is likely to be. And I don't know that many people do, because the data are not super great, and they're difficult to interpret. But my general feeling is that, like, expectations for that aspect of it are low. And when you hear people continue to talk about herd immunity in this very glib way, where it's like, okay, well, if we just get to X% vaccination, like, we're good, we can just reopen. I don't think that's going to work out. Maybe something that's worth mentioning here, which I was concerned by, was a recent report suggesting that the coronavirus genome is actually integrated into the human genome in some patients, and this kind of explains lingering positive cases that show up in PCR testing. So you have someone who gets sick, and then, like, later on has a like, they think it's a false positive. This person has resolved their viral infection, but they're still testing positive on PCR. And this is happening apparently because We have these things called line elements, long interspersed nuclear elements. I think there is what line stands for, and basically what they are, you can think of them as like chunks of your genome that are hopping around and they relocate themselves. And these are probably like foreign additions to our genome from like ancient history. But that enzymatic system, which allows those elements to hop around, involves enzymes called transposons, which are responsible for inserting these fragments into different parts of your genome. And apparently, this can happen with COVID as well. So, I mean, like, this is going to get really complicated when we have a lot of people who've been sick, a lot of people who have been vaccinated. Like, the case counts are going to be very difficult to interpret if we have, like, things like this occurring. The good news is, so far no patients have been identified who have got the entire genome, so it's not like these people are continuing to produce COVID viral particles. They're only producing COVID sequence that's being picked up. So it's like truncated. It's not the whole genetic complement there. But my feeling is that, like, ultimately, if enough people get sick, there are going to be a few, like, tiny proportion of people who have the whole genome integrated and who are just continually going to be generating new viral particles and possibly new variants depending on what happens, in their cells. And that, like, basically the implication of that, and the implication of the apparent difficulty that we have of like shutting down borders and like doing the normal kinds of things that we used to do when there were pandemics in other places. The implication of that is that this is going to be with us for a very long time and is going to continue to crop up in little clusters here and there for a long time.
All right.
Yeah, that's fun.
Yeah, I think, like, in some ways this is the kind of thing that happens in evolutionary history, and kind of is to be expected. It's just that we haven't had this happen to us while we were able to explain it at a molecular level or anything like this, right? So
yeah. Have you gotten a shot yet, Mike?
No, and I will not be until I see a lot more evidence. I just I don't think the risk from COVID to me or my family is particularly high based on our kind of exposure and habits. And I see people lying to me all the time, right? Like, I have a background in toxicology. I have a background in trial and regulatory statistics. I have, let's say, family members in the industry. And when you have kind of like a background like that and people are saying certain things to you, you just realize that, like, not everything is above board here. And I mean, I'm not discouraging anyone else from taking it. You exercise your own reason, you have your own priorities, whatever it is. But for me, I will be waiting. And I will be waiting for a time when I think it's plausible that a mass vaccination campaign could have an effect on the progress of the disease. And I'm not at all convinced that that's what's likely to be the outcome for this particular push now.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess I kind of felt similarly, but I was made available to me for free. And so I just went ahead and said, okay, sure, why not?
Yeah, and
I don't know. I don't feel strongly about it either way.
I'm not even sure that, honestly, like the level of risk that you're taking on, like if you drink, I wouldn't worry too much about the COVID vaccine. You know what I mean? Like if you're
Yeah.
like going out on Friday nights and having like 15 drinks and then like bicycling home or whatever, like your tolerance for risk is probably high enough that the vaccine is going to fly under your radar, whatever it is. And I'm
Right.
not endorsing any of that, but, like, there's no point in blowing this out of proportion.
Sure. That's something like Luis Gomez said on the, I think it was like Real Ass Podcast or something. He was talking about how like he didn't want to get the vaccine and he didn't know what it was and all that kind of stuff. And then his girlfriend pointed out, but you buy like drugs off random people on the street and put like anything in your body. So, and he's like, you know what? You're right. I think I just don't like being told what to do.
Yeah. I think that has a lot to do with it, you know. And I mean, for me, I mean, there's definitely that like psychological component, right? Where it's like, you know, probably people could tell from the explanation that I gave that like I feel like personally offended by, you know, being gaslighted and psyoped in the way that we've been. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess the thing is like people sort of view it as like you have a responsibility to get vaccinated because it's just some clear-cut thing where it's like this is the answer. If you're avoiding it, you're just going to prolong this, and therefore like if it continues as you're suggesting that it probably will, you know, this pandemic, it's your fault for not getting vaccinated. That's the problem, not the policies that have been instituted, not the kind of like shady stuff going on with the vaccines and these companies and all that. No, it's the fault of people who are like taking a measure of like skepticism to this.
Yeah, you know that like I mean this kind of appeal has no effect on me personally, but you know it's annoying. And you know, I mean, I like it's pretty clear that the idea that like for instance, you know, going around for a little while recently was that piece by some researchers at MIT who were looking into, you know, the scientific practices of the anti-masking community, and like the whole paper was basically like, well, like these people are actually like replicating published analyses and like making critiques of them that are sound and like statistically literate, and like, you know, people who are not statistically literate are like not even really respected within this community. You know, they think that science is a process and not an institution, and like, you know, that's why their dangerous misinformation is so difficult to counter, right? Like, because actually they're doing what they ought to be doing, you know, as kind of like citizens, right? So like, because I mean, I was raised with this sort of liberal idea that like, you know, basically like the exercise of individual autonomy would involve something like this, right? Like you would receive a report from, you know, some scientist or something like that, and you would look at it, and if you were, you know, like literate in the way that, or numerate in the way that, you know, our schools claim to produce in students, then you would look at it and you would say like, okay, that looks right. It looks like it was all kind of like done correctly, and I can replicate this analysis, and I can, you know, agree with it because, or disagree with it for some rational reason, and you know, that's respectable, right? Like that's what it means to be an informed citizen with respect to some kind of like technocratic decision making, and you know, that's gone now, right? Like there's if you're doing that, it's a problem because that makes you too credible relative to, you know, the people who are just screaming at you and, you know, telling you that like you're the problem, like you're killing everyone, like you're going to cause the pandemic to last forever. You know, and I just like, I mean, personally, I don't talk about this with anyone really, because you kind of can't anymore. You know, but like, I mean, just for me, it's very clear that like the responsibility for the pandemic is with the people who were race baiting at the start of it and who didn't execute on kind of the basic policy measures that we all understand are necessary in order to control this kind of thing. And you see that now in like the Canadian news, right, where they're like, oh, like lessons for Canadian borders from the pandemic, like they should be closed. You know, it's like, yeah, they should, right? Like, you know, Chinese restaurants are not the first priority, you know, like, or nor is like people being mean on Twitter when there's a global pandemic breaking out. But yeah.
So on that sort of point about like, you know, liberal autonomy and whatnot, Do you think that there's going to be more restrictions that start to kind of roll out on people that refuse the vaccine? Like, do you think that you personally will be maybe put into a position where you'll be unable to do certain things in public or something like that, or travel or anything like that, just because of your status?
I would be sure of it. Like something is gonna happen in that regard, right? Like there are gonna be some types of restrictions. I mean, and like eventually it may get annoying enough for me just where my resistance breaks down, right? Like I'm a huge asshole, so I can go for a long time, but like they may make it difficult enough that I have no choice, or like they turn it into like a child abuse thing, right? Like it'll be like, oh, like if you're not vaccinated, you're abusing your children, we're going to take your children away. Like, yeah, I'll get vaccinated rather than like deal with child protection services showing up at my door or something like that. Like there are definitely ways that they could blackmail me into doing it. And I'm not a mark of the beast person, not a mass sterilization person, so I mean the trade-off there is something that is not going to cause me to have a shootout with the RCMP over this or anything like that. But I
wink wink.
but yeah, I do intend to just avoid it for as long as possible. And I mean, I'm hickey-kneed at this point, so it's like it's very difficult to interfere with me. So I'm confident that I can kind of draw that out for a while. And frankly, I mean, I think socially, like eventually this is going to end up in kind of chaos, right? Like the discursive flip-flops are happening so quickly now that it's like it's becoming difficult for them to memory hole stuff. And like the media is just like so obviously untrustworthy that people who are or would otherwise be like highly inclined to just kind of take whatever CNN or CBC or whatever is saying at face value are now saying like, like the stuff with like the AstraZeneca vaccine or the borders thing or whatever, like it just looks really bad, right? Like, and that's kind of what they care about is the perception of it. But I think eventually, there's going to be a level of dissent and discursive chaos that I think is going to create a lot of like holes for people to slip through. Like I think is even though we do have this like massive surveillance state and all of this kind of thing, like I really think that like the kind of like coercive part of it is going to remain primarily discursive and media based for a long time, because it's so difficult to organize like an actual forced vaccination program or like whatever it is that people are worried about. I mean, like there's a lot of opposition, and there's a lot of like legal hurdles that are left. I mean, we it's hard to say that we have like rule of law in any kind of like fair way, but at the same time, like the government can't do anything, right? So, or at least there are obstacles to that.
Sure.
With these like vaccine passports and this whole idea, I guess like that hasn't fully been implemented yet, so I don't want to speak too soon. But as far as like what they give you now, like here in the US, they give you this little card, and it's just like the person who gives you the vaccine signs it.
Yeah.
Or no, it's not the actual person who gives you the vaccine, but it's at that site, right? Like someone signs it,
right?
It puts on the date, and then there's like the two, it's a 2-shot thing for the one I got, so like there's 2 signatures on there, but it's just a little card, and there's like no, I mean, this is as easy to counterfeit as like a hall pass in school, so it just seems odd, like some of the discourse around this, where this is supposed to be like this big heavy thing, right? Like the vaccine passport, do you have it or do you not? Like, but then on the other hand, like this is going to be so easy to fake if this is ultimately what the passport amounts to.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah, no,
just I don't know. Maybe that's what you can do.
Yeah, I think that's correct. And I mean the like there will be more sophisticated versions of that, right? There's going to be some type of like more computerized database, whatever it is. Maybe with like maybe they do want to do a microchipping thing, like and that's something that they'll go for. But I mean, my basic perspective is that all of this stuff is driven by profit and not necessarily by effectiveness, sure. Right? And I mean, if you look at Israel, or like occupied areas of Palestine, or you look at Xinjiang, right? Like these are places that are about as locked down as it gets. There are still loopholes, right? There are still ways to get around this kind of thing, and like the objective is really to make money for like Israeli and Chinese in sort of IT, intelligence, security companies. It's not
security,
and I mean, like when it comes to, are they gonna like really force you to get the vaccine? Like they don't necessarily care if everyone gets the vaccine. Right, like that it's too that, like I guess this is the thing, right? Like this idea relies on like the vaccine itself being like the objective here, and I just don't think that it is, right? The objective is profits for well-connected insiders, and billionaires continuing to get richer, and that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, maybe we can start building tunnels and stuff all over the place to get from city to city for non-vaccinated people.
If we need to, and there will be like counterfeit passports, and there will be these kinds of, ad hoc solutions to get around this kind of stuff. And I think we just like have to hope that it doesn't come to that. And that there is, sufficient kind of resistance and counterfeiting and all this kind of stuff to just, it'll just go on the pile with all the other grifts that we have and all the other, like middlemen siphoning off wealth from our society without actually contributing anything. That's where this kind of slots in as like one of these kinds of quasi-criminal scams that is run by well-connected transnational corporations and their lawyers and this kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's the American way. That's what made this country great.
Yeah, and it's nothing new, right? I mean, we know how to deal with this stuff. Like you ignore it when you can, and where you can't, you try to get around it. So
yeah, or make a buck off of it.
Yeah,
such an opportunity presents itself.
Sure. Yeah. As Adam Carolla would say, but good times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so let's kick off the question section, and we will do this one since I think this is talking about our esteemed guest here. It says, you guys should have that anti-vaccine retard on again to describe just how wrong he's been about the vaccine rollout and what a moron he is.
Yeah, here I am.
So that was essentially the premise of this episode.
Yeah. Well, I don't know.
Like that's fine. I'm an anti-vaccine retard, I guess. And everyone is who has read any of the literature basically at this point. Like the funny thing is like the way that this is being deployed, right? Like, I'm married to an immunologist. Like I have worked closely with many immunologists. I'm vaccinated. My children are vaccinated. I don't doubt the efficacy of vaccines in any general sense. Nor do I think.
And you're not really on that RFK autism thing either, right? I mean,
no, that's bullshit. I mean, like, I like. This is the problem with this stuff, right? Like, okay, just for instance, like let's say that we were to take really seriously what the science has to say about the process of, drug development and regulatory statistics and all of these kinds of things. If we do that, and we, like this person should really read the book that I mentioned on the last episode, Medical Nihilism, which is not not a book about, like vaccines being evil or being anti-vax at all. It's not really about vaccines at all. It has a more positive view of vaccines than it does of small molecule drugs. But like, you need to go and look at that and understand that, what the evidence tells us is that when drug companies have a lot of input and a lot of control over regulatory trials, the results are uniformly positive in their favor. And when regulators and government agencies and funding agencies are the ones who design the trials and who are not being, shanghaied into action by, a global pandemic or however you want to justify the rapid action that we saw here, when those agencies and groups are in charge of study design, the record of these companies is very poor. And indeed, the development record of most of the major vaccine manufacturers over the last 20 years is very poor. There have been no new vaccines from a large number of internal development departments at most of the big pharmaceutical companies, which is part of why Pfizer went out and bought BioNTech's technology. Right? They didn't have anything going on internally that could address that need. So I think if you look at that, you would be and you were like truly interested in the science, then your prior belief would be the same as my prior belief that I expressed at that time, which was that like probably these things were not going to be the solution to the global pandemic, at least in the short term. And that the rollout, frankly, would go poorly in the broader sense of like we're simply not going to have enough production to get people these vaccines as quickly as would be necessary to have this kind of effect to stop the pandemic in its tracks. So I mean, I stand by everything that I said. I may have made some particular factual errors, but I don't think so. Moreover, I mean, I think if this kind of person is who's saying this kind of stuff is someone probably who is listening to doctors on television. And if you want to look at what the science says about the statistical literacy of doctors, of people with undergraduate medical degrees who get maybe 3 months of immunology in the classroom, like maybe 3 months of statistics, something like that. What the science says about these people is that they have no idea how to interpret their own regulatory statistics, and that in fact statistical illiteracy is one of the most significant problems in that professional community. So it's very interesting that when the media wants to make this impression that like any type of skepticism or hesitancy or feeling that like maybe this is not the light at the end of the tunnel, which is what the TV doctors were telling you, that's anti-vax sentiment. When they want to create that impression, they interview MDs. And when they want to explain like, oh, like breakthrough cases are happening, or like, side effects are there and they're to be expected, and like perhaps even at fairly high rates because we don't have all that much evidence about them, at least high rates compared to other vaccines that we accept as safe, then they roll out like PhD immunologists and epidemiologists and like the academics who study this kind of stuff, and who aren't like and like you'll see this routinely, like in the news, the stuff that's like, oh, like vaccine hesitancy, like it's a real problem, like what's going on with it. It'll be like they're talking to a liver specialist or something. It's like, well, what the fuck does this guy even know? Right? Like seriously, why is this the person who is commenting on this? So I think like if you really seriously look at the literature about what's happening, right? I'm not saying don't look at the literature about the vaccines, but look at the literature as well about how trial statistics are conducted. Look at the literature about how much your average MD actually knows and is actually able to interpret the recommendations that they're getting from their national advisory councils or whatever. Then you would at least be a little bit skeptical. Okay. And maybe I come off as more concerned, or like I come off as especially cynical. And I think that's actually okay if it pushes people just a little bit in the direction of having a little bit more skepticism, because I think that's necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's sort of hard because in the context, you sort of like feel a need to like express a certain view that isn't really as prevalent, and then maybe it comes across as like you're more enthusiastic, or more, you feel more strongly about it than perhaps you actually do, or something like that.
Yeah, and I mean, it is these, you cannot really talk about this stuff, and there are many people in this field who are not happy about the way things have gone, and are skeptical about different aspects of the vaccine, of rollout, of production, all of these things. The idea of like scientific technocratic governance depends on some type of hearing or forum for different kinds of ideas, right? And if basically what we're being presented with is you must like unhesitatingly recommend immediate vaccination for everyone, then it's not possible. It just, you can't really have a discussion about like what is going on, and what the role of vaccines ought to be in the pandemic response. I mean, if you'll remember, I said on the last episode that I did not think that particularly the mRNA vaccines would be any particular risk to a healthy young person. Like not
right. What my takeaway from that was that they would just not do anything, that they were basically,
they're not going to stop the pandemic.
Didn't use this word, but that they would just, like, if there's a problem with it, it's that they just won't be effective, not that they will actually cause some sort of problematic symptoms or whatever.
Well, they're not going to cause people to be like dropping dead in the streets, right? Like that, and that's not what we see.
Right.
But what we do see is problems with some of the production platforms, and we do see problems with what are very clearly rushed drugs. I mean, that's the long and the short of it. Like it's just it's weird actually, because it's like that's what we wanted. Like the whole point of Operation Warp Speed was to rush the development of a bunch of drugs, and that's what we got. And do some of them have problems? Yeah, they do. They really do. Like they're much more toxic than your typical vaccine that's approved by regulators, than a flu vaccine or something like that we administer on very large scales. Like I don't see how anyone could dispute that at this point, right? Like what if people if you were seeing the kinds of like blood clots and inflammation and these kinds of problems from flu vaccines, they wouldn't administer them, right? But yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I always feel that, like, I'm kind of leaning on the side, for me, it's like, I don't know, maybe I'm not too worried about it myself, just because it's like, I don't know, I feel a bit beaten down by all this stuff, and I'm just like, let's see what happens in the future kind of thing, like, not too worried myself kind of thing, but like, or maybe overly worried and now kind of despondent about it, but like, but I do have that feeling sometimes that I'm like, if I did have like a severe side effect and like died from it, like from a vaccine, that like if there was an afterlife, whatever, I would show up and they'd be like, you let someone inject it into you or something like that. They'd be like, and you thought that was a good idea. It'd be like in that Lemmy sketch. Have you ever seen that sketch where other people start using this phrase around him, and then he adopts it as his own, and the second that he adopts it as his own, they all like tear away all of the reality basically, and are like, haha, we just did that to convince, like, to gaslight you into saying a dumb new phrase, basically, kind of thing. I feel like that it would be like, yeah, we set up a universe to test you to see if you would let someone inject poison into you, and you did it because of peer pressure, so you're the moron here. And I'm like, okay, well, fair enough.
That does fit into my idea about doctors. They're all scammers and atheists.
Sure.
And all they know how to do is to write prescription, take drug money, and lie.
Sure.
Yeah,
Not a fan.
I mean, I think you can find, you don't have to listen to me. I mean, I'm not putting my name and my professional credentials on any of this. Like, I don't care if you take this or don't. But I mean, like, you should at least know that, like, my views are not uncommon in this field. Like, that's,
Sure.
so some level of skepticism is generally present but not expressed.
Sure, sure. Okay, so let's move on to some other topics here. This person says, "What is God, and why is he so hot danging darn elusive?" So I thought this was kind of an interesting question because to me, as someone who now believes, God is very obvious.
Mm-hmm.
Like when people who don't believe, like they talk about, like, well, where is this God? People talk about God, but I don't see any God, that kind of thing. I understand that because that's how I used to see the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's, to me, it's just like you're looking for something that, like, it's not, God isn't additive to what is already here. It's more like it's how you understand what you are experiencing and seeing. If you look at it the right way, you will see God, and it will be very obvious. It kind of reminds me of the concept that Ibn Arabi talks about, of like seeing with two eyes. One eye sees that God is everywhere, and the other eye sees that God is nowhere, in the sense that God created everything, he's active in all things, all that kind of stuff. But on the other hand, nothing that you see, no created thing, is like God, so he's transcendent of all that. And to truly understand things, you need to see with both eyes. You need to see how creation, that God is completely transcendent and outside of creation, but at the same time you need to see that he's active in reproducing creation. So if you're only looking with one, you're not really seeing the full picture.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is pretty explicit in most Islamic theology, right? We have a God that is both transcendent and immanent. It's al-batin, he's the hidden, and al-mubin, the obvious, right? Like the apparent. And I think it helps a lot. You basically have to think of this metaphysically, right? Like, do you think that the apparent world is causally efficacious in and of itself in some way that doesn't transcend, like, for instance, a materialist description of it? So do atoms themselves cause things, right? Like, are they in some way deciding where to go or what to do? And you have this kind of idea maybe expressed in some articulations of, like, Copenhagen theory or something like that, where it's like, okay, well, there's a wave function associated with an electron, and that's what's deciding what happens, right? Which justifies this kind of idea of ontological or, like, causal randomness. And I think, like, if that doesn't seem right to you, and you're the kind of person who thinks that, like, maybe there's some broader capital N nature that has some sort of, like, law-like regularities, perhaps punctuated by occasional departures, then you're Muslim, and you're describing God and the habit of God in the world, and you already know what miracles are, so, like, there are different ways to think about this, but, like, you have to engage with reality on some metaphysical level to understand what people are talking about when they're talking about God. Because, I mean, like, the scholars will talk about the traces of God, right? Like, the traces of God's activity, the athar. And that's what you're seeing in the world, right? Like, you're seeing the causal effects of God's activity mediated to you through, this incredible sensory system that you have, which has, like, layers and layers of processing and all this kind of stuff. And angels are doing it all, so that's what's going on, basically.
All right, so this question is interesting. You guys should have an episode on Hajj for both Muslims and non-Muslims, preferably with a guest who already did the pilgrimage, since I think Tom hasn't done it. Correct, I have not done the Hajj yet. I converted recently, but even before that, Al-Hajj seemed such an interesting thing to read about. I would love to know if that gigantic Mecca clock tower is as huge and ugly as it seems, and if Medina is as beautiful as it looks in the few pictures I saw of it. So I think our friend who has been on the show before, has done Hajj, so maybe he would be a good candidate for an episode. I really like that idea.
Yeah, Haji.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, I remember, he had some funny stories about all the different encampments and things like that, like all the difficulties of navigating, because they go in tour groups, right? So there was a lot of little problems that came up too. So yeah.
You have to now.
I guess they like the encamp. Yeah. I think so, and then like with the encampments, I think they organize you by your country of origin and stuff. Mm-hmm. So it's like you have all these different little camps, which on some level I guess that makes sense because like you're probably with people from that country and all that. But I can see that causing problems too. But yeah, that's a great idea. We will definitely look into that.
Alhamdulillah, and welcome to Islam to the brother or sister.
Yeah. All right. How about this one? This question is for Tom only, so don't let Don read or hear it. All right. Cover your ears, Don.
Yep. Sure.
Who do you think Jesus' father is? So this is, I don't think a thing that... Well, in Islam, we have the same idea about Jesus' birth, that there was no... It wasn't a typical, there was a mother and a father kind of thing, like that. What's the term? There's like a certain term.
Immaculate conception, but that's not okay. Yeah, that means you just that actually refers to Mary, but
right.
I know what you mean though. It's basically the same thing. I don't know. Yeah.
I think that technically the way to answer this technically is that he has no father from an Islamic perspective. Does that sound right, Mike?
Yeah, I just always summarized it as like the virgin birth. I don't know.
Yeah, right. Like
the
Quran,
that's what it is, yeah.
The Quran says that God blew his soul into Mary's womb, which is, I mean, he does that with every birth, right? But in this case, there was no father involved in it. So I don't think that's too far from the Christian idea, except that we would never say that that Jesus is the Son of God, and by implication that God is the Father or anything like that. That would kind of go beyond the bounds of what we would say about that.
Mm-hmm.
But,
sure.
Yeah.
But raised by Joseph and Mary, right?
Yeah, I don't think there's any difference really with
okay.
Not that I can remember.
Is there equivalent of the gospel, like a surahs that are about just Jesus's life and teachings and things like that, or?
There are some. It's not as in depth as the gospel, which in Arabic it's called the Injil. So there, I think most of the stuff about Jesus in the Quran is about his birth and kind of his early years, and then about his quote unquote death, his ascension to heaven and the crucifixion and that whole deal. Yeah, it's interesting. The Quran talks more about Mary, I think, than I think Abraham is the one who's spoken about mostly, and then Mary is way up there as in terms of one of the figures that is spoken about most often, to the extent that some scholars even consider her a prophet, even though there are no other female prophets that we have confirmed. So, yeah. Okay. What's something you wouldn't be worried about even if they were real? For example, I'm not worried about vampires being real because I'd just go outside and touch grass. I'm not a loser. I'll just say before we answer this, I really hate the touch grass thing.
What does that mean?
I don't know. I'm getting really just means go outside.
Oh. No,
Like you're stuck inside all day, so you don't touch grass.
you can't make me.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm turning into like a crotchety old man about a lot of these new
yeah.
internet phrases, the way people talk. It just always bugs me. What would I not be worried about, even if it was real, because it would just be silly to worry about it? The vampires one is a good one, I guess. I guess like goblins and little creatures like that, like gremlins and all that kind of stuff. They don't seem like a real threat. I feel like that would not be difficult to handle. Like with the gremlins, you just don't. What is it? You don't feed them after midnight or something? That's just good health practices, right? You shouldn't be eating after midnight anyways.
Yeah. I'll say COVID-19.
I would like to make friends with kobolds, I guess. The dog-headed ones.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was just listening to the Dogman episode that Subliminal Jihad did. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, they, they sound terrifying, but like, what if they were little? What if there is a little one? Wouldn't you want to pet it?
Yeah, a little Chihuahua guy,
There you
go. Tom, do you eat with the fingers on your right hand? I believe this is sunnah. So yeah, it's sunnah to eat with 3 fingers using your right hand. I mean, sometimes I do if it's like, finger food kind of a thing, or especially if it's like Middle Eastern or Indian food where that's just kind of like the way you eat it. Yeah, I will, but I won't really go out of my way. Like, I usually eat like fork and a knife and all that kind of thing. Or if it's a sandwich, I'll, just hold it with both hands. Just a typical thing. I don't know. Do you, what do you do, Mike? You do anything along those lines?
That's firmly in the category of the sunnahs that I do, if I remember. But yeah, I mean,
yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah, if I have a fork or chopsticks in front of me, I won't even think of it normally. The other one I always forget is like sipping water, like the 3 sips of water with the sallallahu alayhi between them. And I mean, Islam is such a big tradition with so many practices that like any given practitioner will only be kind of doing a small fraction of them. But I guess the food sunnahs are relatively strongly emphasized. I mean, maybe I should pay more attention to them.
Yeah, I just feel like I am such a bare bones, like just doing the minimum kind of a Muslim anyways, that it would feel a little bit ridiculous to like start doing all these things that feel a little bit more like this is like bonus points. I just feel like I need to work on more of the groundwork rather than looking for extra credit.
Yeah, if you have like 1,000 prayers to make up or something like that, then yeah, your focus is going to be there probably.
Right. Yeah. In the most recent episode, so this was a while ago, so it wasn't the most recent, but in a recent episode, Agile Tablet engaged a nasty bit of industrial dead naming when she used the industrial slur tar sands. Alberta's oil industry would actually prefer to be referred to as the bituminous sands, pronounced bituminous. Will Donald allow this slandering of the industrial heartbeat of our great country to go on unchallenged?
Yeah, so I don't know. It's funny how much I don't know. It's a big thing in Canada, like just of Alberta, like just freaking out about this kind of stuff all the time. And I don't know. I feel like people are getting a bit tired of it. I don't know. In general, I feel like they had the upper hand for a long time. I feel like right now people are kind of like, I don't know. Maybe it's just that there's so much more whining from everyone else in the world at the same time, like all the small business owners in Ontario and stuff and everywhere, that like they've been kind of on the back burner for now, and also that like, I don't know. Yeah, like it's just, I don't know. But anyways, it's a very frustrating situation with all the, like aggrieved oil industry people. So. Yeah.
The poor oil industry.
Yeah, my sense is that at least part of that, kind of like tired feeling that people have is that the oil industry is just not employing as many people and is not as profitable as it was before. So, the extent to which that resonates with people is probably less.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so let's wrap up with this comment here. It says, the lack of anti-Semitism in a podcast with a Muslim, a Catholic, and a dude called Goatstein is absolutely disgusting. So we will do better in the future. Sorry, dear listeners. I guess this is the thing now. Fartlow.
Yeah, Fartlow. Have you seen this at all, Mike? The
No.
Fartlow.
Okay. Some journalist or something.
Yeah. Just be happy you don't know much about it.
Yeah.
That's what I'll say. Yeah. Well, I don't know. Thanks for coming on. At least I don't know. We had a good chat, and it was fun, although also a bit frightening. Some of the stuff around the vaccines, whatnot, but like. Yeah, always fun to have you on.
Yeah, I enjoy coming on, and I hope people don't get too freaked out. You have to use your reason, and like don't worry about it. Like if you feel super worried about this, just stop thinking about it. It's probably not going to affect you. Like you need to just chill. For anyone who's really disturbed by anything that I've said.
Yeah. Fake vaccine, fake virus. But yeah, we'll have you on again, maybe to not discuss COVID and stuff. I feel like I don't want to pigeonhole you as like the COVID vaccine guy. You have a lot more to offer than that. So next time you come on, we'll have a different topic of discussion, I think.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Just like you're the most knowledgeable person in our group, around this kind of thing. You have like a scientific background. I feel like you can parse a lot of this stuff a lot better than us. So it's just good to get your perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I don't mind maybe staking out a little bit more of a controversial stance. So as long as people realize that, like, that's what I'm trying to do, is just introduce some things that are not getting set into a discussion.
For sure. All right, so if you guys enjoyed this episode and you'd like a second episode of You Can't Win every week, you can get that by subscribing to our Patreon, and you will also get access to our Discord community. If you want to send us anonymous questions, you can do that by going to the Twitter account at You Can't Win Pod, and you'll find a link to the Curious Cat pin there where you can send those in. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you again next week.
Thanks, guys. Bye.